Good afternoon and welcome to the first broadcast of Daily Trust Live TV. Today we're going to be discussing on a topical issue, an issue that has been trending for a couple of weeks now. It's been the talk on the social media and the mainstream media. It's the Abia State Governorship logjam. Currently, there are two persons laying claim to the governorship seat. Recently, the court sacked the current governor of Abia State, that's Governor Okeze Bazu, and a few days after the court judgment, a certificate of return was issued to the second runner-up during the PDP primaries, that's Dr. Uche Oga. Today with me to shed more light on the issue is a veteran journalist, a columnist who writes Daily Trust Monday Backpage, and also the Daily Trust Deputy Editor-in-Chief. He is actually considered to be an authority on Nigerian political history. Hello, Jega, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Sir, what's your take on the Abia State, the current issue in Abia State?
Well, the logjam, as you call it, is unusual in the sense that, at least for the last 30 years since we started having the presidential system of government in Nigeria, we have had cases where the election of governors was quashed by the courts for one reason or another. However, it never led to this kind of logjam where two people, one sitting on the post, the other not on the post but has got a certificate of return, when the matter had not gone through the whole gamut of court appeals. This is the unusual situation about Abia. Otherwise, even between last year's election and early this year, courts nullified the election of governors in Rivers State, in Akwa Ibom State, and in Taraba State. But it didn't lead to any logjam because the governors whose election was annulled had the opportunity to appeal to the Court of Appeal and even to the Supreme Court. And no action was taken until they exhausted the appeals process. And in all those three cases, they won on appeal, so they remained on their seat. So to that extent, what happened in Abia this time is unusual and shameful.
So, do you think this case can be concluded within this before it's at the tenure? Because when either party loses, the other one can see has either to go to the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court. And going by our antecedents, there are several cases like that of Anambra State, whereby it was after 3 years. There was a similar one between Arebeshola almost, and there is another one between Agagu and that's late Agagu and Shegun. Do you think this one will last that long?
Well, I don't think this one will last that long. You see, if it were at the election tribunal, the Electoral Act had provided for the speeding up of electoral cases, just to avoid those kinds of situations that you mentioned. There were gubernatorial cases that were quashed after the governor had exhausted 3.5 years out of the 4-year tenure. Now, in order to avoid that, when the Electoral Act was amended in 2010, a provision was made for speeding up the cases, and time limits were set. That means if somebody goes to the election tribunal, it must dispose of the case within a certain period of time. And the Court of Appeal also has a time limit, and similarly with the Supreme Court. However, this particular one is not through the election tribunal. It is at a federal high court, and therefore there is a tendency that it may drag on because it does not have the same time limit as the election tribunals. However, given the public interest and the security implications involved, I suspect that both the appeal court if someone goes there, and the Supreme Court will accelerate the hearing, and this matter could well end one way or another before the end of this year. That's my expectation.
Okay.
Yes.
The word on the social media is that INEC were actually quick to issue the certificate of return to Oga, but that was about a couple of days back. Something similar happened, and we did that in Adamawa State. And INEC, within 24 hours after Larry was that the deputy governor who they said he actually didn't resign.
Yeah.
So when he was reinstated, within 24 hours he was sworn in.
Yeah.
So do you think that in this situation, INEC was actually quick to also offer?
It was quick because INEC had never done anything of the sort. The difference was that Ngilari was sworn in because he won at the Supreme Court. If somebody wins a case at the Supreme Court, of course you should hurry up and implement it because there is no further opportunity for appeal. But this one, Oga won at a high court. So you know that Ekpeazu has the opportunity to go to the appeal court and even to the Supreme Court. Now the reason INEC gave for issuing the certificate of return, and by the way, as we said earlier, if you remember, let's take just one example. Last year, a tribunal ruled in favor of Hajia Aisha Alasan in Taraba State. But she was not given a certificate of return because the governor, Darius Ishaku, had the opportunity to go to appeal court, which he did at Supreme Court, and ultimately he won. The same thing in Rivers, the same thing in Akwa Ibom. So the reason INEC gave was that the Abuja Federal High Court ruled that the judgment should be that the man should be given a certificate of return immediately. But this is always how a court rules. But even if a judge says he should be given the certificate of return immediately, the High Court judge knows that this is subject to appeal. Okay, there are other complications, like INEC said. The fact that Ekpeazu appealed to the Court of Appeal is not an automatic stay of execution. That is true. But all they have to do is to wait a few days. He will get a stay of execution because the Court of Appeal will always give a stay of execution pending the hearing of his appeal. But to rush on the basis of the High Court judgment within 48 hours and give a certificate of return to Oga is what has caused this confusion. And then the confusion was compounded by a High Court in Abia State, which now issued an order saying the certificate of return should not be recognized by the Chief Judge of Abia State and he should not swear in Oga as the governor. Now that was also indiscipline of the highest order because one court cannot override another High Court. It requires the appeal court. But that judge was in a hurry and he probably needs to be dismissed. Right.
Okay, sir. So, and it was actually reported that Oga was represented by about 5 sons or there by senior advocates of Nigeria. And recently in reports, we've been hearing of reports of some persons being represented by outrageous numbers of sons. So is this a recent phenomenon or it has been in existence, it hasn't happened before?
Well, wherever a case has serious political importance and public interest, sometimes the litigants make a show of being represented by a very large number of lawyers, some of them big sons. But apart from maybe psychological and all that, it doesn't make any difference. In the end, it is the arguments you make before the judge that will determine the case. And whether you have one lawyer or you have 100, it doesn't really make any difference. Maybe apart from psychological, because maybe the judge may feel somehow intimidated if he sees so many sons filling up the court. Otherwise, it shouldn't make any difference.
Okay. So we have a question here from a reader. His name is Bishop Obert. He says, what corrections can be done with Abia and can the certificates be reversed?
Well, the only thing that can be done now has to be by the Court of Appeal. Since Ekpeazu has gone to the Court of Appeal, the most likely thing that will happen, although I shouldn't preempt the court, is that they will give a stay, which means the certificate of return that he was given by INEC is somehow invalid. for now. If they give a stay, that means the condition precedent, Ekpeazu remaining as governor, remains until the case is finally determined. And of course, even by the time the appeal court makes a ruling, somebody will still go to Supreme Court, whether it's Oga or it's Ekpeazu. Whoever does not win at the appeal court will go to Supreme Court. But again, what should happen is there should be a quick stay pending the going to the Supreme Court, so that this kind of thing does not happen again. Not only in Abia but in other places, because we must avoid this kind of situation. It could easily have led to a breakdown of order. Two people claiming the governorship.
Okay. So another question here. What is it, if Oga wins, should he win? I'm not saying he's going to win. He's going to be the second person who actually did not participate in the actual campaign process who becomes a governor. That's leaving one of them.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is your take on a person who did not contest an election becoming governor?
Well, morally, honestly, morally, it should not happen. Morally, it should not happen, because the election is all about mandates. At least under the presidential system. You know, it happens in other situations. Like just today, this Madam Theresa May is going to become the Prime Minister of Britain, and she didn't win any general election. But that's okay. That's the parliamentary system of government. Whoever is the leader of the party with the majority in parliament becomes the Prime Minister. But under a presidential system of government, and the first thing that it happened in Nigeria was actually in 2007, the Amechi case. And it was the Supreme Court. Amechi went to the High Court and said he won the PDP primaries and should have been the candidate, but the PDP leadership at the national level rejected him and instead forwarded the name of Celestine Omehia. So Omehia contested the election, he won, but afterwards the Supreme Court ruled that Amechi should have been the PDP candidate, and since the PDP ticket won the election, then Amechi should be sworn in as the governor. It was totally unusual and very surprising, but that was the first time it happened, and probably that is why it is happening again in the case of Kogi. And as you said, if Oga ultimately wins at the Supreme Court, then he will be like the third person to become governor without contesting the main election.
The buzz on the social media is that INEC seems to have special interest in this issue. Are you?
Well, I don't know whether they have a special interest, but I think personally that they made a mistake by issuing that certificate of return to Oga without waiting for Ekpeazu to obtain a stay of execution and bring it to them, which was just a matter of days. What they said about the Abuja Federal High Court saying the judgment should be immediately implemented, I think that excuse does not hold water, because that's how every court rules.
Is there a chance, because like in 1983, during there is one Elijah Lasan Bokar, Bagadoshi, I don't know if you know of him. Bagadoshi. He contested, yes. He contested governorship election of Niger State under NPP, that's the Nigerian People's Party, and he lost to Alhaji Awad Ibrahim of NPN. And he actually contested the election, took it, and it was almost like 20 years later, where after his death, that was about 16 to 18 days after he died. That was when he was said to have been the rightful person to have won that election. Do you think this particular case can actually get that?
Well, I think that was why the Electoral Act, as amended, tried to limit the time period within these cases should be determined. And it's not even because of death. 16 years is an extremely unusual kind of thing. Although in our judicial system there are some cases that go for 40 or 50 years, especially land cases and things like that. But the political cases normally don't last that long. Now, what the Electoral Act was even worried about is a situation where somebody is elected and inaugurated when his election is still being challenged. Because given the Nigerian condition, that one creates all kinds of problems. Once the guy is inaugurated as a governor or president, then you can imagine he has more resources, he has contacts, he has power, he has this and that. So that puts the guy who is challenging his election at a disadvantage. But the case of Alassane Badekoshi, I knew him personally. I'm sure you were not born that time. I knew him in the northwestern state. He was a civil servant in Sokoto that time. And the case had all kinds of drama in 1983. And I was not surprised that the court ultimately said he won, because the NPP made a lot of gains against the NPN in Abia State in 1983, and they even won the senatorial election for Niger Central that time. The candidate, Professor Jerry Gana, the NPP candidate, defeated Mr Mahmud, the NPN candidate. But when it came to the gubernatorial election, the incumbent NPN governor was declared elected. Within 3 months, the whole Second Republic was overthrown, but Badekoshi's case went on even after his death. So it was quite unusual. So even discounting death, we don't even want a situation where somebody will be inaugurated before the main concern for now. So in the case of the Piazzu, as I said, probably the appeal process will be accelerated, and the appeal court and the Supreme Court should dispose of it before the end of this year.
If you're just joining us, this is Daily Trust TV, first live broadcast, and with me is Mr Mahmud Jega. And the topic for discussion is Abia State Governorship logjam. So another question for you. On the social media, if you're active, some people are saying that this particular incident is a boost for democracy. And they felt that this logjam that's happening means our democracy is growing.
Well, I personally don't think it is a boost in a way. It is a setback for democracy, because definitely the law and the electoral processes do not envisage a situation. In fact, they are designed to prevent a situation where more than one person will be legitimately claiming the same position. That is chaos. I don't see how democracy can advance that way, with two people, each one of them with certificate of return backed by a court order. No. I don't think this is an advancement for democracy, but probably by the time it is sorted out, then it will help in the future that a similar situation does not occur again.
Okay. Some people are of the opinion, one of the reasons that ICPAS is using as defense is that tax clearance is actually not a requirement to contest election. But some people are saying that as such, he should be allowed. He is actually not guilty. Whereas some group of persons are saying, irrespective of whether it's a prerequisite or not, for the fact that he actually submitted it, it means it has to be verified. And if there is a problem with it, he's supposed to face the consequences. So what do you think?
Well, certainly the law requires that an election candidate must have paid his taxes as and when due. And this is not even a new provision in the Nigerian electoral law. It has been there since at least 1978, because in 1979, in the run-up to the election in 1979, FEDECO, as INEC was called that time, tried to disqualify 2 of the 5 presidential candidates, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and Malam Aminu Kano, on the same grounds that they paid their taxes but not as and when due at the electoral axis. Now, as and when due means in 2003 you paid your taxes in 2003, in 2004 you paid in 2004, not when you are planning to contest election this year, you go and find that I have not paid taxes for the last 5 years, so I calculate all the 5 and pay. If you do that, you have paid your taxes but not as and when due. So it's one of the requirements of the Electoral Act for a candidate's election to be valid. And you know there are other provisions, not just in the Electoral Act, but in other laws. For example, you know, there is an age requirement. You must reach a certain age before you can contest election. Now, there are other laws that says if a court has declared you bankrupt, you cannot contest election. Or if there is medical evidence that you are not of sound mind, you cannot contest election. Now, if you have been convicted for a criminal offense involving any act of dishonesty, maybe not for a traffic offense or anything, but if you are convicted of fraud, you also cannot contest election. So there are many things like that. And certainly payment of tax as and when due is one of them. However, it is up to the courts to resolve that. The Federal High Court has said that Ikpeazu didn't pay his taxes as and when due. Well, who are we to say that is not the case? It's only the Court of Appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court that can determine. I have seen all the arguments he's making, that he was a civil servant, so he was paying pay as you earn. Yeah. Fine, let him take that case to the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court. If they uphold it, then he will probably remain in office.
Okay. So, what do you think? Since Ikpeazu still has a certificate of return, sorry, Ms. Oga, Dr. Oga, what do you think he should do? If you were him, what would you do now that you have that certificate of return?
Well, he has done the first thing that he should do, which is to take the certificate of return that INEC gave him to the Chief Judge of Abia State and ask to be sworn in. He has done that, but he didn't succeed for some reason. The next thing for him to do is to go to the Court of Appeal and say, look, I have got a certificate of return issued to me by INEC, and I want you to issue an order of mandamus. That's what they call an order of mandamus, to compel a public officer to do his duty, because ordinarily if you bring a certificate of appeal, the Chief Judge must swear you in. But now he is refusing to swear you in. So you can ask for an order to compel him to swear you in. However, I suspect if the case is consolidated, the Court of Appeal will say no, will not grant you that order because we are sitting in appeal on the substantive issue of whether Ikpeazu has paid. Wait until we exhaust that. If we exhaust that and you win, then we will certainly give an order for you to be sworn in. So if I'm to advise Ikpeazu, that's what I'm advising, but I doubt if it will succeed. Okay. I doubt.
Recently, that was actually in about a week. Recently, the NGF, Nigerian Governors Forum, Governor Yari, addressing Southeast elders that were in Sokoto during a particular event, he said that they're actually looking into the matter and they're trying to get an amicable resolution. Do you think that the Nigerian Governors Forum can actually sway the decision?
No, it is not a political. It's not political dimensions, but essentially it is a legal and judicial issue. It is before the courts, and it is only the courts that can really untangle it. You know, maybe elders might appeal to Oga and say, look, why don't you wait? But it's difficult to tell a man who is holding a certificate of return that he should be patient and things like that. It will require the appeal court to say no, despite the certificate of return, there should be a stay and he should not be sworn in. That is the only way this matter can be resolved. I don't think the Governors Forum can do very much, although what their chairman, Governor Abdulaziz Yari, said is very true, that they are concerned because we don't want this kind of thing to happen in any other state, because it can lead to a breakdown of law and order.
So what would you say are the lessons to learn from this particular incident, this particular logjam?
Yes, well, that is very good. I think the main lesson to learn, which the courts probably should also learn, is that as soon as somebody wins this kind of judgment at a high court, the guy who lost should immediately ask that same court for a stay of execution and announce that he is appealing. Therefore, he is asking for a stay of execution of the judgment pending the conclusion of his appeal. And we expect that court to grant the stay immediately, so that an agency such as INEC does not now say, because there is no stay of execution, we are giving the other person a certificate of return, which makes no sense of the appeal process. But the appeal process is constitutional and very important. So I think that is the main lesson to learn. There should be a speedy stay of execution pending the termination of the appeals.
Okay. We have a question from another reader, that's Jamilu Musa. He said, what is the AGF role?
Ideally, the AGF has no role here because it's not a criminal case. It is somebody contesting the qualification of his opponent to contest one election. So the state is not involved at all in this matter. The only thing probably is to say that if Ikpeazu loses up to the Supreme Court, then possibly at that case he has a criminal case to answer because he didn't pay his taxes. But you see, unfortunately in Nigeria, we do not follow up in such matters. Like you made earlier reference to governors that were removed in Edo, in Ondo, in Ekiti. Look, like let's take the example of Edo State. That man who was sworn in before Ishimole, I think Professor, I forgot his name. You see, if the tribunal determines that you rigged the election and inflated votes in your favor, and the appeal court and even the Supreme Court upheld it, ideally, the police should immediately arrest you and prosecute you because you committed a criminal offense. But you know, nothing happened. The guy just walked away and somebody else was sworn in as governor, and that was the end. Shouldn't have ended like that. That's the way I see it.
Okay. This other question, people are like, the INEC, they shouldn't have in the first place, if there were discrepancies in his tax record, they shouldn't have even accepted him to allow him to have contested in the first place. So some people are actually laying the blame on INEC for even allowing him to contest in the election.
You see,
what do you?
Unfortunately, it is the Electoral Act that created that situation. On the one hand, it set out all kinds of qualifications before you can become the candidate of a political party. And then it denied INEC the power to screen you out. For example, you cannot contest as a member of the House of Representatives unless you are, I think, 25 or 30, I'm not sure. But if a political party forwards your name to INEC, and it is stated there that you are 23, and the law says you have to be 25, INEC still cannot reject you because the Electoral Act says that INEC must accept the name of anybody who is forwarded by his political party. It is only left for your opponent to go to court and say this guy is not qualified to contest on grounds of age. But you know, that is a waste of time. And INEC argued before the last election that the Electoral Act should be amended and it should be given the power to screen out a candidate where a case of the breach of the law is clear, like this one. Like this one. If you are underage, why should we accept you and allow your opponent to have to go to court and contest? Say, why not we straight away say, no, but the Constitution says you have to be 30 before you can contest, and you are 23, so we are not going to accept you. But the Electoral Act says INEC must accept any candidate brought by his political party. So if PDP brought the name of Ikpeazu, it is not for INEC to say that Ikpeazu didn't pay his taxes as and when due. Okay. It's not for it. It must accept it. But if his opponent has that information, then he can go to court, which is what happened. So to that extent, INEC is not to blame. If they have any blame, it is that hurry to give certificate of return to Oga, in my opinion. Yes.
We have another question from a reader. His name is Awal Mohammed. CIA. He said, who deserves to be called a governor? That's between Ikpeazu and Oga.
is a tricky. It deserves to be called. Well, to the extent that each one of them has a certificate of return. If you call yourself a governor, I will not fault you. But the truth is that for now, Oga cannot call himself a governor because the chief judge of Abia State did not swear him in as the governor. Although the truth is that in other cases, the courts have ruled that you are a governor from the day you are elected, not from the day you are sworn in. Let me remind you, when Atiku Abubakar was elected the governor of Adamawa State in 1999, before he was sworn in, Obasanjo nominated him as his presidential running mate. So he relinquished the governorship. And Mr. Bone Haruna, who was the deputy governor-elect, said, well, since Atiku Abubakar, the governor-elect, has relinquished the post, I will now become the governor. And his opponent said, no, you cannot be the governor because you guys, you and Atiku, were not sworn in. But they went to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that Bone Haruna can take over because he and Atiku were governor and deputy governor from the day they were elected, even though they were not sworn in. So if the governor, for any reason, relinquishes the post, either dies or resigns or anything, the deputy can take over. So at least there is that judicial precedent.
We actually have another question from a reader, but we've actually talked about it, but just you can just shed a little more light on it. His name is Jamil Musa. He said, what is your advice to Oga? I
think, as you said, we answered that question before. He has a certificate of return. He can ask the Court of Appeal to compel the Chief Judge of Abia State to swear him in based on the certificate of return. But as I said, the Court of Appeal is likely to grant a Piazu a stay pending the final determination of the case, even up to Supreme Court.
Okay. Sure, thank you. If there's going to be an electoral act review, what are one or two things you think should be changed or at least amended?
Well, sitting here, I cannot easily say, but you know, there are some things like the one I mentioned earlier. If somebody is not qualified to stand for election very clearly under the laws, why should INEC go ahead and accept him because his party forwarded him, only to open the gate for litigation down the road? However, I agree with those who say that if you give INEC the power to screen and reject candidates that were forwarded by their parties, you may solve one problem and create another. You will solve one problem and create another. For example, if you have a partisan INEC and they decide maybe to punish the opposition party, you bring your candidate validly nominated and INEC rejects him, and the election goes ahead without him, even if the court subsequently declares that he was qualified, the election has already taken place. So that is why I said, sitting here, I cannot easily, but I know that INEC has got all these lawyers and also the experience it has had from the election. And after every election, INEC usually suggests amendments to the Electoral Act to the National Assembly. The 2010 amendments were made based on the experiences of the 2007 election. And after the 2011 election, INEC also submitted a list of recommendations for changes to the Electoral Act, which were never passed before the 2015 election. Maybe this is the time to consider that. And it is better to do it when an election is not in sight. Because when you are trying to amend the Electoral Act, let's say in 2018, by then maybe the candidates are known and everything, it will look like you are amending the law to favor one candidate or another. So we better do it now when the election is still very far away and nobody knows who will be the candidate in 2019.
Okay. Thank you very much. And there's another question here from another reader. His name is Garba Abubakar. He said, if the governor fails, both by governor here it means Ikwazu, that if the governor fails both in the court and in the appeal, can a criminal case be maintained against him? Of course, you've said something about it, but just...
I've said something like that, if the courts ultimately determine that he didn't pay his taxes as and when due, that itself is an offense. And you asked earlier about whether the Attorney General has any role. And it is at that point that either the Attorney General or even the police can just come in and say, well, the Supreme Court has just said that you didn't pay your taxes as and when due, and you know that paying tax is one of the lawful requirements of any citizen. So we are taking you to court. But as I said, unfortunately, even people who have committed what we may see as bigger offenses than that, like inflating the vote in an election, by the time the court said they inflated their votes and they removed them as governors, they just walked away. Nobody charged them to court. And we should have done that as a deterrent in the future.
Yeah. Now, the final question before we round up. This one is from Ango Idris, and you've actually mentioned something similar, but he said, if there is provision for appeal against judgment, why must INEC issue certificate without giving time to determine if sitting governor will appeal?
I said so. I said so. That was what caused the whole logjam. That was what caused this whole Abia logjam. And even for INEC, it was unusual, because there were governors that lost at the election tribunal last year, like Wike, like the governor of Cross River, and like Governor Darius Ishaku of Taraba. They lost. The tribunal ordered their opponents to be sworn in, but the opponents were not given a certificate of return, because it was known that the incumbents will go to on appeal. And they did, and they won. So you see the danger. Now you have given Oga this certificate of return. Now Ikpeazu goes to appeal court and Supreme Court. If he wins, what will you say? You will say, okay, so he has even won, so it was, we shouldn't have rushed to give Oga. So I think that is the main lesson to learn, because that was what caused this whole Abia logjam.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Jega, for the insightful chat. We actually appreciate you being our first guest, and we hope to, in the nearest future, to get you to talk to us again. And for those watching, we thank you for staying with us, and for those who ask questions,